If you're leading a team today, you have absolutely felt it. That kind of invisible friction in the room where different ages, experiences, and expectations all seem to collide. We're quick to label it a generation gap, but what if that's the wrong problem to solve entirely? Today, we're going to dive into how to lead the whole person, not the generational stereotype. Welcome to this explainer on leading across generations. I'm your host, Taylor, and I'll be your guide. Let's jump right in. This single quote from Rusty Calloway's research really just reframes the entire conversation. The friction that we feel isn't about trying to manage different age groups as if they're completely separate species. No, it's about leading unique individuals who just happen to have been shaped by different life experiences. And this right here, this is the core idea we're going to build on. So here's our roadmap. First, we'll talk about a crucial cognitive shift, a new way to think about all this tension. Then, we'll get into how to build a unifying culture that's based on shared human needs. After that, we'll get super practical with specific coaching tools from the 5E playbook that you already know. And of course, we'll wrap up with a direct challenge for you. All right, first up, the cognitive shift. This is all about changing our own minds before we try to change anyone else's behavior. It really is the first pillar of the whole person leader approach, cognition. So here is the key point, and it's a big one. Research consistently shows that different generations actually share the same core values, things like family, respect, a desire for growth. The conflict doesn't come from the values themselves, it comes from how we interpret each other's actions. Our life context literally creates a different dictionary for the exact same words and behavior.
And this slide, it just perfectly illustrates that interpretation gap. Just imagine a leader says a super simple phrase, "Keep me posted," okay? A Gen Xer who was raised to be really independent probably hears, "Solve it yourself and only call me if there's a catastrophe." But a Gen Z employee who is much more used to constant feedback loops might hear, "I'm nervous about you. I need constant granular updates." The leader's intent gets completely lost in translation, and then frustration just builds up on all sides. So this brings us to this idea of values versus artifacts. An artifact is, well, it's just the visible behavior that represents a deeper value. Let's take respect, for example. Everyone here values respect, but for an older generation, the artifact might be deferring to the hierarchy. For a younger person, it might be about being included and heard. When those artifacts clash, we completely misinterpret the other person's intent. We see entitlement instead of a desire for inclusion, or we see dismissiveness instead of a respect for structure. So how in the world do we break this cycle of misinterpretation? Well, we use a tool called the assumption audit. It's a really simple 4-step mental drill. Instead of just reacting to a behavior, you pause. First, you identify the story you're telling yourself. Then you separate that story from the actual, observable facts. Third, you get curious. You ask yourself what you might be missing. And finally, you try to identify the shared human need that's driving their action. It's a game changer that moves you from judgment to genuine inquiry. Okay, let's move on to our second section and see how all this builds a unifying culture. This is what we call the heart set, the second pillar of whole person leadership. It's all about creating an environment where these different interpretations can be safely explored instead of, being weaponized. And the main goal of this kind of culture is psychological safety. It is the absolute bedrock. Without it, a younger employee won't suggest a new, better way of doing things because they're afraid of being mocked. And an older employee won't ask for help with new tech because they're afraid of being labeled a dinosaur. Safety is what unlocks contribution from every single person on the team. Now, to build that safety, we need a kind of universal translator for human needs. And Dr. David Rock's SCARF model is just perfect for this. It identifies 5 universal social drivers that our brains treat like actual survival needs. When these needs are met, we're in a collaborative toward state. But when they're threatened, we go into a defensive away state. So really, leading across generations is just the art of managing SCARF. Let's look at status. This is not about ego, it's about feeling valued. Do I matter here? An older worker feels a status threat when their decades of experience are just ignored. A younger worker feels that exact same threat when their fresh ideas are dismissed out of hand. The solution? As a leader, you have to decouple status from age, publicly praise the value of institutional memory and the value of a new perspective. You make it a win-win for everyone. Or let's take autonomy, our sense of control. For a Gen Xer, this often means, don't micromanage me, just leave me alone to do my work. For a millennial or a Gen Z, it might be more about flexibility and where or when they do their work. The leadership solution here is to provide guardrails.
Be crystal clear on the non-negotiable outcomes and deadlines. That's the what and the when, but give people freedom and choice in the how.
So, we've shifted our mindset, we've focused on building a unifying culture. Now let's get to the third pillar, coaching. This is the skill set, right? These are the daily actions that bring all of this to life.
So for those of you who follow our work, the 5E framework is going to be very familiar. Engage, empathy, equip, empower, and encourage. These are the core behaviors of a whole person leader. But now let's look at them as a specific playbook for navigating this multi-generational workplace.
Let's start with engage. The tool here is the 2-minute connect. It's so simple but incredibly powerful. It's just a brief daily conversation that has nothing to do with work tasks. How was your weekend? What are you excited to work on today? This small daily investment builds that sense of relatedness and trust from the SCARF model. So when you do need to talk about tasks, the relationship is already there. Next up, equip. One of the biggest sources of friction is just ambiguity. The ODC framework, that's outcome, deadline, and clarifiers, it solves this. It forces a leader to be crystal clear. What does done actually look like? When is it due, specifically? And what are the guardrails or resources? This provides the certainty that all generations crave, and it prevents all that frustration that comes from rework.
And finally, let's look at encourage. Generic praise like good job can feel pretty empty. The SBI model makes recognition actually land with impact. You name the situation, you describe the specific behavior, and you explain the positive impact. This works for a skeptical boomer because it's factual and data-driven, and it works for an eager Gen Z because it provides that specific, validating feedback they need. It reinforces exactly what you want to see more of. Okay, we've covered the mindset, the culture, and the practical coaching tools. So let's wrap this all up with your leadership challenge.
If you remember just one thing from this entire explainer, let it be this number, 5. The 5 universal needs from the SCARF model. They are your common ground. They unite a 22-year-old new hire and a 62-year-old veteran. It's time to stop managing generational labels and start leading to these 5 shared human needs. So here is the final question for you to take away with you. Looking back at everything we've covered, the assumption audit, the 2-minute connect, using ODC or maybe the SBI model for praise, what is one single behavior you can commit to practicing this week to stop managing differences and start leading through that powerful common ground?